We're here to tell you that we want something to disappear. We want the death penalty to disappear. And I'm going to tell you my story. My world became pretty much unraveled on July 26, 1987. I was down in Virginia with a group from my church. We'd gone down to work on a Habitat for Humanity project. We were on our way to Charlotte, North Carolina. Stayed overnight in a Methodist church. Got up on Sunday morning. We went to an early breakfast, planning to go back to an 8:30 service at the church. We were sitting in the restaurant, and all at once somebody said, "Is there Walt Everett here?" I said, "I'm Walt Everett. There's a phone call for you." Tried to figure out who could possibly know that I was sitting in Shoney's restaurant in Petersburg, Virginia. 8 o'clock in the morning on July 26, 1987. Got to the phone, found out it was the pastor of the church where we had stayed. He had recommended 3 or 4 restaurants the night before, and so he just started calling around until he found us. He said, "Walt, you've got to call home. There's an emergency." I called home. My 20-year-old son, Wayne, answered the phone. "Dad, are you sitting down?" I lied. There was no place to sit down. The phone was hanging on the wall, so I said, "Yeah, I'm sitting down." He said, "Scott was murdered last night." Scott was my 24-year-old son, the oldest of 3. I wound up sitting down on the floor involuntarily. The group that I was with came over and asked what was the matter, and I told them, and so they immediately made plans to put me on a flight back to New York. We went over to the Byrd International Airport at Richmond, and we stood around waiting for my flight time, and we stood in a circle. We're all wearing blue Habitat for Humanity t-shirts, 8 of us, standing in a circle, and we're praying together and crying together and praying some more and crying together. All of a sudden, one teenage girl looked up and she tried to lighten it up, and she said, "People walking past us, they must think we're some kind of a cult, all wear the same kind of t-shirts, standing here praying." Well, I cried with that group. Then I got on the plane, and I found out when I got on the plane that the group had bought me a first-class seat. It's the only time in my life I've ever flown first class. I usually fly cramped up between 2 other broad-shouldered people, and I can't even turn the pages of a magazine. But that day I had plenty of room. I no sooner sat down, and the airline attendant came over and said, "Can I get you something to drink?" And I said, "I'll have a ginger ale." She went and got it, and then she said, "I'll be right back. I need to take care of some of the other passengers." She came back within 3 or 4 minutes, and I then found out that they had told the airline what had happened, because she sat with me for the entire trip from Virginia up to LaGuardia in New York. And she sat there and did exactly what you ought to do in that kind of situation. What do you think that was? Anybody? Listened. Most of us have a tendency to try to fix something like that. There's no way you can fix it. So she just listened. The only time she would say anything is if I stopped talking. She'd say, "Tell me some more about your son." So I'd start talking again, and I cried, and she cried with me. We got to New York. I got off the plane. I figured, boy, I had already shed a lot of tears. Some there in the restaurant, some with the group at the airport, some with the airline attendant. I've just about shed every possible tear in my body. I got to the top of the escalator, started down toward baggage claim, and I saw at the bottom of the escalator a couple that had come to meet me. Started to bawl again. We picked up my luggage, they drove me home, saw my family, and started to cry again. Then we began the process of planning a service that nobody should ever have to plan. Grandparents and parents you expect to die before you, a spouse or a sibling. You know right from the start there's a 50-50 chance. I just buried my twin brother this past summer. You know that there's a 50-50 chance with that. But a son or daughter, it's never supposed to happen. And when it's a violent death intentionally carried out by somebody else, that increases the trauma exponentially. Well, we sat and planned for about 2 hours, and finally Wayne said, "Are we done planning?" I said, "Yeah, I guess we've done about all we can for now." He said, "I'm going out for a little while." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to see if I can get the guy who did this." That's exactly what I felt. "What?" "Wayne, I've lost one son. I don't want to lose another. You've never been a violent person. Please don't start now." Well, he thankfully honored that request. The only thing we knew about the guy who had killed Scott was that he had been arrested almost immediately. He was high on cocaine and alcohol, and he'd been arrested almost immediately. The judge set a $500,000 bail. He had a friend who put up a cottage, a summer cottage. They raised the money for a bail bondsman, and he was out in a matter of hours. Didn't know what he looked like. We knew his name, and that was it. Wayne did go out with friends for about an hour. He came back. They let him out in front of the house. He walked up the walk. There was a big old maple tree. He took his fist and he slammed it into the tree. He was so angry. The tree didn't move, but he shook off his hand. He had hurt it quite badly. But he had to express his anger some way. The next day, my twin brother arrived from Colorado. We went down to the apartment building where Scott had lived and where the murder had taken place. And we began to ask some people what they had seen. They told us some things that we thought were pretty significant. We said, "Did you tell this to the police?" "No." "Why not?" "Well, they never asked." "Do you mind if we take this information to the police?" "No, please do." So we went down to the police station. There sat two detectives. Their backs to us, they were facing the wall. Their desks faced the wall. They never had the courtesy to turn around and face us. I could understand they were quite busy. They were reading the morning paper and drinking coffee. One of them, as we started to talk and told them some of the things we'd found out, they took no notes, and one of them finally turned around and said, "Look, you don't need to do this. We've already made an arrest." I said, "But when you go into court, you want to have as tight a case as possible." The other one turned around and said, "Look, we're burned out. We've had 4 homicides this weekend." This was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for a while the homicide capital of Connecticut. He said, "We've had 4 homicides this weekend and we're burned out." I said, "One of them was my son. He's not simply 1, 2, 3, or 4. He's Scott Everett." And I was angry at the police as I went out of there. Angry now that Scott's dead, angry at the guy who killed him, though I didn't know what he looked like, now angry also at the police. A few weeks later, I was asked to join a group called Survivors of Homicide. It was a support group that exists in Connecticut, support group for families of homicide victims. And I went to my first meeting figuring I would get some gentle compassion, understanding. I got there and I heard one woman say, "Everybody who ever kills anybody should be taken out and shot immediately, no questions asked." I understood that anger. My anger was new, it was deep. But then I found out that her son had been killed 14 years earlier, and she was still carrying that tremendous weight of anger. I agreed with her anger. I wondered why it had taken her so long to begin to heal. But I didn't agree with her conclusion because I've always believed that there are a lot of things wrong with the death penalty. We don't have it within our right to take somebody's life no matter what that person has done. God does not call us to be vindictive. God calls us to be merciful. Then I heard somebody else at the group say something very similar to what that woman said. His daughter had been killed 20 years earlier. I went home and began to ponder that. Is that what the rest of my life is going to be like? I knew that my anger was destroying me then, keeping me from doing my work properly, keeping me from relating to people. I began to wonder. And I began to pray, "Dear God, how do I unload this anger?" How many of you have ever prayed and not gotten your prayers answered? That's what I was feeling for a long time. God, why aren't you answering my prayers? But we're told in the Bible, pray without ceasing. So I continued to pray. There's got to be a reason for this. I prayed, still got no answer. Finally, I began to realize that God was saying to me, wait. What do I have to wait for? I don't want to wait. I want an answer now. Just wait. On May 1st of the next year, a little over 9 months after Scott's death, I got a call from the prosecutor, the state's attorney. He said, come into my office. I'd like to discuss the case with you. I went in and sat down, and he said, we've come to a plea bargain with the person who killed your son. What are the terms? Well, he was originally charged with homicide. We've reduced the charge to second-degree manslaughter. He will plead guilty, and in turn, he will be sentenced to 10 years, suspended after 5. I said, 5 years for taking Scott's life? You think that's fair? Well, I know you don't like it, he said. But in the first place, you don't have any say in the matter. The state is the injured party. The state prosecutes you, and you're just a bystander. If you thought I was angry before that, I'm just a bystander. It's my own son. But that's what we know is retributive justice. Who has broken the law? How do we punish them? I've since become involved in a movement called restorative justice. You begin with the victim. Who has been hurt the most, and how do you bring healing? Secondly, how do you encourage accountability on the part of the offender? Third, how do you restore trust to the community because everybody's afraid now? And fourth, how do you change the systems in our culture so that we reduce the level of violent crime? How do we make education, good education, available to all? How do we provide medical care for all? How do we provide enough food and decent housing for all? We're not living in those kind of conditions right now. We're living under a system that calls for retributive justice. Little pieces of restorative justice are occurring here and there, but we have a long way to go. Retributive justice. Who has broken the law, and how do we make them pay? So I was just a bystander. Secondly, the attorney said, we don't have as tight a case as we would like. And of course, my thoughts went back immediately to that lack of conversation with the police. I stormed out of there angry at the state, angry at a system that allows for a plea bargain. I subsequently found out that that plea bargain was a gift, because 2 months later, the beginning of July, we went into court for the sentencing of Mike. The case was opened, and the judge said, is there anybody who would like to speak for the family? Well, I stood up. I felt somebody had to do something. I even resented that, though, because I understood this to be a victim impact statement. It was obvious that this was not going to have any impact on the sentence because that had already been agreed to. So I felt I was just going through the motions. But I spoke probably for 10 minutes, have no recollection of what I said. And then the judge said to Mike, the offender, would you like to say anything? He got up, he put his head down, and he said, I'm sorry I killed Scott Everett. I wish I could bring him back. Obviously, I can't. These must sound like empty words to the Everetts, but I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry. And that's what I mean by it being a gift, because he could not have said that if he was on trial. He had already pleaded guilty, so he could say, I'm sorry. I thought about what he said. And immediately, the person next to me turned to me and said, he didn't mean that. He was just trying to impress the judge. I said, I don't know that. I heard what he said. I looked over at the other side of the courtroom, and I saw 2 lonely-looking gentlemen sitting there behind Mike, and I walked over to them afterwards. And I said to one, are you Mike's father? He said, no, I'm a friend of the family. The other one, are you his father? No, I'm his uncle. His father was too sick to come to court today. And I said, you must be hurting too. And I began to think what it must be like to be the parent of somebody who has killed somebody else. And I've carried that out to people who have been executed. And I've wondered what it must be like to be the parent of somebody who is killed by the state. and I'm convinced that their pain is no less than mine when my son was shot. And I've come to know several people in that situation, and everyone tells the same story of their pain, of their loneliness when their loved one is executed. But I went home from court and I began to think about what had happened, and I felt as though God was nudging me, you've got to respond to this. How do I respond? I can't go visit him. I don't want to. But maybe I can write him a letter. But I have a problem with that even. I'm a procrastinator. How many of you are procrastinators? A few honest people, yeah. You'll be happy to know that my definition of procrastination has absolutely nothing to do with laziness, everything to do with a sense of perfection. I'm a perfectionist. I want to do it exactly right. I don't know how to begin, so I wait till all the ducks are in a row, and then I can start. Remember, that definition comes from a self-proclaimed procrastinator. But I knew that as a procrastinator, I would not ever feel like writing that letter. So if I waited till I felt like it, it would get done. If I waited until I wasn't too busy on one day, that's a problem in itself. Because as a pastor, I can work 90 hours a week and nobody notices whether I'm working more than 30. But I would have always an excuse. There is something to do, and I would never have the time to write the letter. So I had to select a particular day on which to write the letter. Any ideas what that day was? Pardon?
Easter?
No. This was July.
Oh,
Anniversary of Scott's death. Right. Easter was a good guess, but it was the anniversary of Scott's death. On July 26th, I sat down at my desk at 8 o'clock in the morning, which was precisely the time a year earlier that I had gotten a phone call. And I said, Dear Mike, it was exactly a year ago right now that I got the phone call that Scott had been murdered. And I began to tell him of all the anger and loneliness and frustration and the way this was tearing my family apart and all the other kinds of things that were going on. Went on for a page and a half, and finally I said, Mike, having said all of that, I want to thank you for what you said in court on the day you were sentenced. And as hard as these words are to write, I forgive you. Went on to tell him of my understanding of God's love and forgiveness. And then invited him to write back if he wanted to, but I said, if you don't want to write, I'll understand that also. Put the letter in the mail and felt the burden start to lift just very slightly. No instant healing. Some people will try to tell you they've had instant healing. It may happen, but rarely. It's a lifelong process, and every day it gets a little better. But as I put that letter in the mail, I felt that burden start to lift a little bit. Then I went back into my office, had the most productive afternoon I had had in a year, on a day that I didn't think I was going to be able to make it through. Well, I waited for 3 weeks, didn't get a letter. I went away on a planned vacation. A few days later, my daughter, Jonna, who was then 19, called and said, Dad, there's a letter here from Carlucci. I said, that's good. Why would he write to you? Maybe he's answering my letter to him. Why did you write to him? You remember what he said in court on the day he was sentenced? Yeah, well, I felt I had to respond to that. May I open his letter? No. Why not? To whom is it addressed? You. Then you know why you may not open the letter, right? Oh, come on, Dad, please. All of you females in the room, you were daughters of somebody at some time. Is that the way you worked with your fathers? Most girls do. I finally convinced her that if she would wait till I got home, I'd let her read the copy of the letter I sent to Mike, and if there was nothing that she shouldn't see in Mike's letter, I would let her read that as well. I got home, I showed her both letters, and we stood and cried together. I wrote back to Mike on the basis of his letter. His letter actually didn't say much. Thank you for writing to me. I'm sorry it took so long to write to you. I had to get special permission from the warden. When I got your letter, that's the first good night's sleep I had gotten since I got to prison. He didn't say much else. He asked me to write back. I later found out that when he got my letter, he didn't want to open it. He looked at the return address, took it down, threw it on his counselor's desk, and said, "Why is he writing to me? He knows I can't write to him. He's trying to harass me." Started to walk out. The counselor said, "Wait a minute, Mike. What do you want me to do with it? Do what you want with it. Would you like me to read it?" "I don't care," but he sat down, obviously interested. And as he read, Mike said he could read people's eyes. He was a drug addict. And as he read, Mike began to say, "I don't think there's anything I want to see in that letter." But he got over to the second page and got to those words, "I forgive you." And Mike says now, his eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. And Mike began to think, there is something I want to see in that letter. The counselor finished the letter, handed it to Mike. He started to read. He wasn't feeling too good about reading it until he got over to those words, "I forgive you." And he says, in all his life, 28 years, nobody had ever said those three words to him. And he started to cry. Mike was 2 months old, when his mother left the family. He was the youngest of 4 kids. His grandmother moved in to take care of the kids. His father was working 2 jobs. His grandmother died when Mike was 10, and from that point on, every day when he got home from school, from that time until he went to bed, there was no adult supervision in his life. He wound up getting into an increasing amount of trouble, and by the time he killed Scott, by his own reckoning, he had been arrested 43 times. But here he was, never having heard the words, "I forgive you." But he kept getting into trouble. Every time he got into trouble, people would want to punish him. But at least he was getting some recognition, some attention. Negative attention is better than none for somebody who doesn't feel very good about himself. Well, I found that out later. But I started a correspondence with Mike, and after a couple of months he wrote and said, "Would you come visit me?" And again, that's exactly what I felt. Come visit? I don't want to do that. God, you asked me to write a letter. I thought I was doing what you asked me to do. You didn't tell me there was going to be something else. But I wrote back to Mike and I said, "Mike, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. I don't know how ready you are, but I'll write to the Commissioner of Correction and ask for permission. If he gives me permission, then I'll deal with it." I wrote that letter, put it in the mail slot, and as it dropped in the slot, I'm sure I said a secret prayer, "Dear God, please make sure this guy says no." Well, he didn't say no, but it took him 2 months to answer my letter. He wrote back, gave me permission, and at that point, I then realized I was going to have to start dealing with it. So I called the chaplain at the maximum security prison where Mike was. There was a complex of 5 prisons there together, all different levels. This one chaplain was responsible for all of them. I called him and said I wanted to come and visit Mike, and he said, "Okay, when would you like to come?" I said, "What days are visiting hours?" "You don't have to come during visiting hours. This will be a professional visit. I'll do the paperwork. You come when you feel like it." So I told him the day I wanted to come. The day came for me to go up there. I drove all the way up, about an hour and a half, to the maximum security prison. I went over, I checked in, and I told him who I was there to see. And the officer behind the desk said, "You sure you got that number right?" I said, "Yeah." He looked it up. He says, "He's not here." "Not here? This is where he was sentenced. What have you done with him?" "Wait a minute, let me check." He went into the other room. He came back. He said, "He's just been transferred over to medium security." So I went out and got in my car. It was just down the road. I was just ready to turn the key in the ignition and felt a tremendous sense of rage that the state of Connecticut would so quickly move him out of Max. Ridiculous, isn't it? I'm going to talk to him about forgiveness, and I'm furious that he's been moved out of Max. I had the sense not to drive while I was feeling like that. I got out of my car, did 6 laps around the perimeter of the parking lot in December, no overcoat on, dressed in a suit and tie. Anybody looking at me must have thought I was nuts. My wife of the last 15 years, said to me one day, "Have you ever thought about that, the layout of that prison?" Why? What was unusual about it? Well, has it ever occurred to you that overlooking that parking lot there was a tall guard tower, and somebody with a high-powered rifle probably had his sights on you all the way around that parking lot, 6 laps? And I said, and I got out of there alive. I couldn't believe it. But I got back into the car finally. I drove over to meet him, went up and I identified myself. They said, "Come in." Before I tell you what happened next, I got to tell you that as a pastor, I've been in over 40 jails, prisons, and lockups in 7 different states. I've always believed that we have a responsibility to people who are in prison. And in fact, when Jesus said, "Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit those in prison," that was not multiple choice. Got to do them all. So I've always felt that we have a strong responsibility there. But never was I so thoroughly frisked as I was that day, because that day I wasn't a pastor, I was a father. Finally ushered me into a room where Mike was to be brought in. They brought him in. I looked at him and I said something totally meaningless. I said, "Mike, you've gained weight." Nothing to do with what I had gone there for, but it was an easy way to get into the subject. What else was I to say? He said, "Yep, I gained 55 pounds in 5 months." He was living on drugs and alcohol for at least a year and probably 2 or 3 before he went to prison. And in fact, one of his friends later told me that he would have been dead in 2 months if he had not gone to prison. But he said he's gained 55 pounds in 5 months. He said prison food doesn't taste very good, but at least it's nourishing. Well, we soon got into other stuff. By the end of the visit, I was just ready to leave. He said, "May I invite my counselor in? She wants to meet you." So he invited her in, and we sat and talked another 10 minutes. And then I got up to leave, and I started to shake hands, but somehow that didn't feel right, and instinctively we embraced. Because our lives had been brought together by that event in a way that nothing else could. The counselor stood and said, "I think I'm going to cry." Mike and I had beaten her to it. I went home from there, continued to write and to visit for the next 2 years until finally in one visit, Mike said, "What would you say if I told you I was thinking about going before the parole board and asking for an early release?" I said, "Mike, you're not the same guy who has killed Scott. God has changed your life, and I don't think there's any percentage in the state keeping you in prison any longer. Go for it. You could be a productive member of society." He said, "Would you say that to the parole board?" So 2 months later, I stood before the parole board. They were tough on me. They were easy on the inmates that I heard them interview. Mike wasn't yet in the room. But then they said, "You have something to say?" And I said, "Yes." They quizzed me almost hysterically before I got into what I had to say. I finally told them what I had to say, and one of them said to me, "Are you done?" I said, "Yeah, I guess so. You may be excused." "May I stay and hear what Mike has to say?" "You may be excused." Properly chastised, I walked out, drove home, wondered what had happened. That night, Mike called. They gave me a date of June 1st. At that point, he would have finished 35 months. He said, "I was hoping for an even earlier date." But then I found out that of everybody who went before the board today, I was the only one who got an early date, and I'm convinced that what you said made the difference. Mike came out, went to work for a trucking firm. He's been there ever since, about 16 or 17 years. He was there less than a year when his boss made him a supervisor and told me one day he's the best supervisor I've ever had. But far more than that, Mike goes out and speaks wherever he can. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, churches, high schools, colleges. And the group he enjoys speaking to the most, people in prison. He's one of only a half a dozen former inmates that's allowed to do that in Connecticut. And he says, I like speaking to them because I lived among those guys. I know how they think. And I think I can help them more than I can help anybody else. He's a productive member of society. He's helping so many people. If I had refused, I guess I couldn't have refused that plea bargain, but if he had been given a long sentence like I wanted him to get, he would not have come out and begun to serve society. If he had ever faced the death penalty, I know that none of this would have happened. But even more, I know that I myself would have still been living with a tremendous amount of anger, waiting for him to be executed if I was in favor of the death penalty. So many people wait for that event that's going to begin their healing. They wait for 10, 15, 20, 25 years through all the appeals, becoming increasingly angry every time there's another appeal. And then they wait for that event that the prosecutor has said is going to start the healing process for them. It happens, the person is executed, and the family members say, why don't I feel better? Their loved one hasn't come back, and they've wasted 25 years waiting for that event, and they could have begun the healing process many years earlier if the person had been sentenced to either life in prison or a long prison term. They would have said, well, now it's over. Now I can go home and look for a better way. Wait for the event. It doesn't happen. Healing is not an event. It's a process. And we who have been through it have to learn that that process needs to begin as early as possible if we're to become productive members of society. I thank God that God has changed Mike's life and that God has changed my life and enabled me to begin to heal in all of life. And now I'm going to turn it over to Juan.